Buongiorno, welcome everyone. Thank you for participating in our Rome book club titled Raphael's School of Athens, the Medium and the Message. For those of you who are joining us today for the first time, my name is Silvia Dall'Olio. I serve as the executive director here at the Rome Global Gateway. It is a pleasure for me to be accompanied today again in this journey by Professor David Mayernik, associate professor in the School of Architecture, a practicing urban designer, architect, artist, and writer whose work has been exhibited and published internationally. In our first meeting, Professor Mayernik and his guest, Professor Roland, reconstructed and discussed Raphael's life, including less known aspects for us. Today, we will focus on the fresco painting process, getting our hands dirty, so to speak, as we learn about materials involved, wall preparations, and painting techniques. Today's guest is Professor Richard Piccolo, also on the faculty of the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture. Professor Mayernik will introduce him in detail, but for now, I just wanted to say hi. Thank you, Professor Piccolo, for being with us, and welcome to our book club. Before we jump right into the conversation, I'd like to take a few moments to provide some logistical information. Questions for faculty are more than welcome at any time. To submit them, please use the Google form that we're sharing with you right now. We'll try to respond to as many questions as possible, but if we don't get to them all, please do know that we have a private moderated link board, discussion board to continue the conversation. This program is made possible by a number of people, including Costanza Montanari and Danilo Domenici here in Rome, campus staff, as well as the co-sponsors for this series, the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture, the Center for Italian Studies, and the Notre Dame Alumni Association. As in previous appointments, we will have a 15-minute breakout session so that you continue to meet each other and discuss today's topic in small groups. We'll hold those breakouts at the end of the formal portion of the program. Should you not wish to break out, you may choose to leave the meeting at that point. As always, a few pre-recorded videos, audio listenings, and articles are posted on the ThinkND website, where Professor Mayernik discusses and demonstrates a few themes from the topic. And now, David, please take it from here with Professor Piccolo. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. And thank you to everybody who helps to make these things happen. And welcome back to those of you who were with us for our conversation last week. And welcome to those who were not and are joining us maybe for the first time. Last week, we encountered the artist and his world. And this week, we're encountering his work in buon fresco. So what skills did Raphael need to paint in fresco? How is painting on a wall different from painting on an easel in a studio? What's the connection between the manual and the cognitive abilities in an artist and a person? I mean, do they facilitate each other? Do they get in the way? There's a certain prejudice, probably you could say, that artists aren't particularly intellectual by nature, and yet we know that Raphael was knowledgeable enough to do, as we heard from Professor Roland last week, some thinking about what actually goes on in the School of Athens. And we're also finally going to talk about fresco painting in the contemporary world, in the modern world, in Italy, and hopefully in America as well. To have that kind of conversation, we have the ideal person, and it is not just because he happens to be my colleague here in Rome, but I would have a hard time finding somebody better to have that conversation with than my colleague, Professor Richard Piccolo. Richard is a painter, he's a connoisseur, a colleague, and he is also a friend. And he has taught drawing and watercolor to decades of our architecture students here in Rome. His hallmark as a teacher is getting them to loosen up, to think boldly, and to take some risks. Like Raphael, he's an inspiring teacher. His own work itself, and he is an accomplished artist and especially painter. His work is bold, and it's not too much to say, it's actually brilliant. He's a master of both form and color, and his work is deeply informed by the history of art, which allows him to not only do the things that he does, but also talk about them. Richard has lived and worked in Italy for most of his adult life, lucky him. His work has been exhibited throughout Europe and the United States, and he's also painted murals for the Crown American Corporation, the US Bank Plaza building in Sacramento, California, and the Hotel Pierre in New York City. His awards include the Edwin Austin Abbey Fellowship in Mural Painting to the American Academy in Rome, National Endowment for the Arts Grant in Painting, and a Classical America Award for figurative painting. He has a Bachelor of Industrial Design from the Pratt Institute, during which time he took evening figure drawing classes at the Art Students League, and he may talk about that. And he has an MFA from Brooklyn College. In addition to teaching drawing and watercolor at Notre Dame for our students in architecture here in Rome, Professor Piccolo serves as the director for the Pratt Institute Architecture Program in Rome. So it's my pleasure to welcome Richard and start our conversation.
Thank you, David.
And I'm, again, I'm gonna sort of pose the questions, but Richard and I talk about these things all the time, and it'll be hopefully a back and forth conversation. And then eventually we're looking forward to hearing some questions from you. And the kind of things that we're going to talk about are going to kind of range a little widely. And they're going to, start off with talking about mural painting, but they're going to get into the nature of, sort of how Raphael went through the process of doing one of these things, from the conceptual to the execution. And then again, I would like to have a conversation about the contemporary, modern, let's say, practice of fresco, because there is one that's, in fact, just last week, there was an article in the Washington Post about an American fresco painter who spent a long time in Italy, Ben Long, and his work in fresco in North Carolina. So I'm going to ask Richard, because he's actually done this. So what's it like working on a wall or a ceiling? Because Richard's also painted a ceiling painting, a mural, which I've never done. So what is it like working in a space, an architectural space, on a wall surface or on a ceiling? I mean, what kind of issues do you have to deal with?
Well, it's extremely dramatically different from being in the studio. My experience was a ceiling. The other things I've done were on canvas and then put up into the building, installed. But in this particular case, I was working on a ceiling, and you are confronted with problems of what do you really need. This particular ceiling wasn't very, very high, so it wasn't as if it's not like the Sistine or anything, where you need lots of scaffolding. But of course, I needed to have some kind of scaffold, and you have to work it out somehow. You have to feel it out. You have to, all right, I have a scaffold. How high is it going to be? Do I stand on the scaffold? Do I lie down on the scaffold? So you start, and you have to sort of get used to the situation. I found that it was impossible to lie down. It's impossible to mix paint lying down.
Right. Gravity.
Well, you can't see what you're mixing. So I could sit on the scaffold and reach up. That's possible too, but it's the proximity of the surface itself as you're looking up rather than looking horizontally towards something, which was a new experience for me. So it was, I had to figure out how I could actually see enough of my surroundings to know what I was really doing. I mean, I had a drawing for it wasn't a fresco. I was working, I had the surface prepared with an absorbent ground, golden absorbent ground surface, because I wanted it to look like a fresco. So the absorbent ground is, and I painted in acrylic. So the absorbent ground is that kind of thing. You can use washes and it soaks in. So it's like, it reacts like a paper. So that was what I wanted in terms of the feeling. But in any case, so as I was saying, it's not fresco. So I didn't have to deal with other problems that a fresco would present.
But a lot of the physical problems are constants. I mean, Richard and I were talking about this yesterday. when you're painting, you can only paint essentially as long as your arm is and the size of the brush, from the wall. So when you're painting, your distance from what you're painting is only basically as long as your arm and the brush, which means, if you're painting something that's bigger than what you can see in your field of vision, it's hard to evaluate it, judge it. And, Michelangelo famously changed his whole approach to the Sistine ceiling when he kind of climbed down off the scaffolding after he painted the flood, and realized that, it was so far away and the scale of the figures was just not appropriate to the space. He had to adjust. So we were talking about, how did you actually adapt to that, the idea of painting from, whatever your arm was?
Yes, it's the distance. You can't, on the scaffolding, I can't step back to see the painting because it's on the ceiling. It's a horizontal surface.
Yeah.
So, and even if it was a vertical surface, it would be different. You can't step back very far on the scaffold unless you have the whole room covered with the scaffold. So I had to basically run up and down on a ladder, but to initiate the thing, I realized I had to draw at a greater distance than I expected to. So I hooked up a brush to a bamboo pole. So I was using a brush that was probably, I don't know, 4 feet long, roughly. So that I could actually stand, since it wasn't a very high ceiling, I was actually standing on the ground or on a box or something, and looking up and drawing, so I could understand how things were related, one next to the other. When you're close, the closer you are to the surface, the more distorted everything is, and therefore you don't. I realized I was thinking I was moving over to one kind of corner or to the left, which I needed to do. And when I got down from the scaffold, I saw that it wasn't right. It wasn't where I thought it was. So I had to basically do all my crucial movements and set marks on the ceiling as I went along from the floor. Now, if I were in a higher space, like, a church or, a big hall or something like that, you wouldn't have to go all the way down to the floor, but you'd have to go down to a level where you could actually get a cone of vision which gave you the proper relationships.
This is why, we can come back to this and talk about the drawing in the cartoon, but the idea of the cartoon is to be able to see it all, and it generally emerges from a smaller study, which we can talk about. One of the things about fresco painting and doing it in Italy is, a lot of times and anybody who's ever been in a recently poured concrete basement, for example, in a new house, knows how cold and damp it can be. And, if you're up against a kind of a freshly plastered wall anytime other than the summertime, it can be actually quite cold. In fact, fresco painters actually had seasons where they mostly didn't paint in the winter, partly because the day was shorter, so you didn't have as much natural light. And partly because it was just cold and damp in there, and it was really hard to focus and get your work done. At the same time, a damp day means the plaster dries more slowly, so you have more time to paint. But there are a whole series of physical challenges. Like you're talking about your body relationship, your ability to see what you're doing and judge it as you execute it, which is, again, also why with fresco especially, you didn't really want to improvise too much, because it was very hard to judge what you're doing on the spot, because if you don't like it, you have to take all the plaster off and replaster it, right? And we have all kinds of stories of people having done that. I've done it, actually, I have to say. You have to admit defeat sometimes.
well, that's part of being an artist, that you can't, being a craftsman, it's just part. You're an artisan, really, at this stage. Some things don't work. Some things have to be changed. And you're lucky if you can do it. Sometimes I mean, I wouldn't want to be a sculptor and have to, if I made the wrong move and knocked off a finger of a
Right.
piece of sculpture, I mean, I can't get it back.
That's what
So-
Michelangelo, that's why he said sculpture was harder than painting, because a painter can constantly change and add whatever they want, but a sculptor, once you take stone away, you can't kind of glue it back on. So
Right.
it's true that although fresco is also one of those things, and maybe it's why Michelangelo really thrived at it, it's sort of unforgiving in that way. I mean, it's hard to make corrections or changes in
Yeah.
fresco.
Yeah, you don't want to do it. You just you when you start it, you think, let's just do it right and get it all done, but you don't want to have to go back. Imagine. I mean, this is all the thinking about what it must have been like. You're dealing with people who you're working with, a whole team of people that are preparing stuff, that are mixing things, that are, moving the scaffold or whatever they have to do. So you involve a lot of people if you don't do the job properly. I mean, if you're not happy.
Yeah, everybody has to do their work again if you don't like
Yes, right.
Now, Raphael seems to have had a different painting technique for whatever medium he worked in. I mean, so he's capable of working, in a kind of an almost miniaturist mode sometimes.
Yes.
There's that vision of Ezekiel that was in the Raphael show, which is spectacular, but it's about this big.
Yeah.
And so he seems to have had a technique for fresco that was, in a way, it seems to me, different than how he painted when he painted in oil or tempera. I mean, do you see that, and how do you think his painting technique is different?
Oh, it's different in terms of, it all has to do with scale and knowing how much to cover at one time. It has to do with, I mean, when an artist starts his career or her career, they have to deal with different things. I mean, I would think that's the most important thing, to actually, it's like, today, maybe like a musician who is multi-talented with different instruments. So if they're playing the piano, it's one thing. If they're playing the violin, it's another. How do you get the sound, a certain sound? It means you have to adjust your movements. You have to adjust. It's not only of course, it's the instrument too. So if you're painting with a brush, a fine brush, that's one thing. If you're painting with a wide, brush, if you're painting with a long handled brush or a short handled brush, or you're painting in a material that's water soluble, that is also, you can get into trouble if you're putting too much pressure on the brush, which disturbs the layer below that you're painting on. So it is making every technique your friend by learning it, and I think doing it over and over and over and over again until you understand what it can do and what it cannot do.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the craft. That's really the craft side of art. I mean,
yes.
You could think of it like with a musician, like just the manual dexterity to be able to execute music, and then then there's all the other stuff that makes it music and not just a bunch of notes.
Right.
It takes a kind of sensibility and a sense for the rhythm and the kind of quality of the music that's independent of just the mechanics of making your bow do something or holding the flute in a particular way. And so that part is what allows Raphael to do what he did. It's not the end of what he did. I mean, there's a lot more to the School of Athens than craft, but it is the thing that allowed him to basically make that sophisticated, composition come to life.
Well, there you're talking about what makes him special. So, but I would imagine that all the artists of that period, would understand how to craft with the craft. Excuse me. They would have experience, and they would have a kind of a similar experience, and they would understand how to handle various media and approach things in the proper way.
Right.
I
They
mean,
got that training. I mean, again, Raphael got it, from his
yeah,
father. I mean,
right.
he grew up in that culture. Michelangelo, again, a little more, I hate to call him self-taught, but I mean, a lot of ways he is, or he certainly takes what little formal kind of training he had and extends it. But you're right, the foundations were pretty common. And, and it's also interesting what every artist did with what their foundation was and how they pushed it and extended it. And, Raphael's painting technique in the School of Athens, well, certainly in the stanza, in the whole room, it changed. And it probably changed heavily under the impact of having seen Michelangelo's work on the Sistine Chapel. So it's not just also what you inherit, it's what more you think you can, and that's Raphael's in some way great achievement, is always that sense that there's something better, there's something more that you could be doing with what you know, and that you're constantly open to pushing it and evolving it a little bit.
Yeah. I think that somebody as great as Raphael, and there are other wonderful artists of the period, they had a certain kind of confidence of, they made a lot of mistakes, I think, in their career, in the sense they got over those mistakes. They worked them out. And so they had, if they didn't go so well, they know they could redo it, they can do it better. It's the confidence that gives you the freedom to extend, to go one step further, to take chances.
Yeah.
And I think they did. I mean, a lot of them did.
Because you're in command of, you're in command of what you do. I mean, you know what you're doing, which means you can also, and you're prepared to fail, because it doesn't mean you're a failure. It just means that particular thing didn't work out, and so you can try it and do it again.
Yes. It's I just one thing. I think it's just it's you're dealing like a great musician playing. You're dealing at that level, at such a high level. It's interpretation. It isn't really technique anymore. They're not really thinking about technique. They can even miss a note, but it wouldn't matter. It's the interpretation of the piece in a way which is spellbinding and powerful, and makes that musician special. So that's real freedom.
No, it is, and some of that, again, I would argue some of the freedom in fresco comes from the thorough preparation. Do you want to say something about drawing in the fresco process, and anything from the initial conceptual idea to the cartoon?
Yeah.
What's the role of drawing in basically allowing you to do what you need to do in a fresco or a mural in general?
Fundamental. I mean, I think drawing is the basis of a certain kind of a freedom. And it is constantly being, I mean, as you proceed, just to develop a composition, whether it's fresco or on canvas, it is you see these preparatory drawings by Raphael and a lot of other, of course, artists of the same period, where they're thinking. The drawing is the thought process is going on. What do I do? Well, I put it here, I put it there, and so forth. I move this, I change that gesture, I intensify this, I de-intensify that. And so you have always seeing a number of sketches that relate to a particular work. And so it shows you that it's the thinking process toward it arriving at the solution, let's say, the final idea. And it doesn't mean that even there, you don't find changes from the final drawing to the finished painting. And as we were talking about, I was talking to you about this when I was up on this scaffolding in the Sistine, looking at, happened to be lucky that day, it was the creation of Adam, that part of the ceiling where they were cleaning. I could see the impression that was of the line of the edge of a leg. And the impression is what you would get by putting the drawing against the plaster and making with probably the handle of the brush or something, just making a little pressure on that, and you would get a groove in the intonico, in the plaster. Well, I could see the line that Michelangelo had made, but the painted edge was completely different. He decided, even in that short period, that he saw something and he said, no, I've got, that leg should be, 6 inches above what I drew it. And he just painted it that way. So
he's
so,
correcting
anyway,
maybe for something that has to do with the curvature of the vault and how that's going to seem, and all the but that's risky, I have to say. I mean, I tend to maybe really rely too much on the cartoon when I paint a fresco, because I don't necessarily feel like I want to improvise that much. But that's when you're really in command of what you're doing, is when you feel like you can kind of rethink it up there on the wall, like it's like a high wire act. There's like,
yes. I was a bit shocked to see that. I mean, I didn't. I also saw the pounced lines, and that's from the cartoon, which he respected. I mean, all over the place.
Yeah.
But then when I saw that, I said, "Oh, whoa."
Well, I mentioned that in the videos that I did, or I think I mentioned it, but that there were two methods of transferring the cartoon onto the wall in Raphael's day and Michelangelo's day. There was the pouncing, where you punch holes through the cartoon, make little holes, pounce a bag with some pigment, and you get a dot on the wall, a series of dots, and you connect the dots with a brush. But because you pounced color on there, you're kind of stuck with that. Whereas that incised line, once you're done painting, is almost invisible, especially when you're 60 feet down from the Sistine ceiling. No. So the incisione, or the incising method, I think, one, it became more common because it was faster, but two, it didn't impose anything on the wall because it was essentially semi-invisible. I mean, you can see it when you're up close to it, but most people wouldn't see it. We're getting some questions coming in, which is good. And I wanted to get through with Richard, just because of, Richard had something called the Edwin Austin Abbey Mural Painting Fellowship to the American Academy in Rome. This is, a few decades ago. And that fellowship doesn't exist anymore, because that's sort of not what art is about at the American Academy in Rome. But the reason we had one of those is because when the American Academy was founded in the 1890s, when the new building was built in the 19-teens, so I think just before World War I, when the fellows were there after World War I and into the 1920s, they were actually painting murals in the loggia of the American Academy as part of their requirement for what they were doing as fellows. So we actually did have a mural painting, not just a mural painting, but a fresco tradition in the United States. And there was one in Italy. Do you want to say anything about either the Italian or the American mural painting tradition?
Well, I mean, the Italian tradition going
in the 20th century. So
in the 20th century. Oh, yeah. Well, it's always been important in Italy. It's part of their heritage and part of their way of thinking, I think, even architecturally. So that it's the building. I think that's extremely important. The idea that the fresco is part of the building. It belongs in a specific place, and it's not to be removed. It's considered along with the architecture. So it is integral. Now, in the United States, it wasn't that way probably so much, but the importance of looking toward Europe and wanting to decorate surfaces, I think, was important in the United States too, in the 19th century, early 20th century, and that also continued on into when they did the WPA, we were talking about this,
Yeah.
that was, again, they were making post offices. They were making new administrative buildings. And so that kind of sense of a public space with a message was important. And what do? You have to show the message. You want to show the people what this building is about and what it means. And so that goes right back to Italy in a way. And so the American artists tried to learn the fresco technique, and they did some marvelous things.
Yeah.
Also Mexico. I mean, also you have to remember Mexico had this incredible group of artists who were doing big murals in Mexico as well.
Right. I mean, that, and you mentioned the WPA, you know, to give artists work in the 1930s and to basically partly help revive the fresco technique, because again, there were a lot of different ways of doing murals. Fresco was a particular way of doing a mural. And the WPA actually put out manuals about fresco technique in the 1930s to basically help artists who, you know, were going to work in courthouses or post offices, you know, kind of recapture that technique, which had kind of gone out of favor. But, you know, we did have a big mural painting tradition in the United States in the turn of the last century. I mean, the turn of the, you know, into the beginning of the 20th century, in state capitals, the Minnesota State Capitol building, which I know reasonably well, had an extensive mural cycle. The Library of Congress obviously has an incredible mural cycle. I don't know how much of the Library of Congress is actually buon fresco. And in Italy, after the war, the interesting thing is there's a man named Pietro Annigoni who was a portrait painter. So was actually made a lot of money painting portraits, actually painted Queen Elizabeth and essentially semi-retired, basically retired from portrait painting after having made a lot of money. And in the 1960s, the late 50s and 1960s, started doing mural paintings pro bono for churches. So basically unpaid for churches around Italy, some big ones and some small ones. And he trained a whole generation of people, including Ben Long. So there was this Washington Post story a week ago about Ben Long's frescoes in North Carolina, and he was a student of Annigoni. And so there are a variety of ways in which the fresco tradition kind of survived through the 20th century, and still today there are people who still do it. I mean, I'm one, but there are others. There are Italians who are either part of the Annigoni tradition. I actually learned not from Annigoni but from a restorer. So the way fresco stayed alive in the 20th century was either from Italian restorers restoring frescoes and learning how they were made by restoring them, or from a handful of artists like Annigoni who kept painting them.
Yeah, I actually learned what a little bit I know of fresco. I've only done small ones, transportable panels, but I learned from a restorer of fresco here in Rome.
Yeah.
When I came over and I was at the academy. But it requires a real, mission and intent. It's not something you encounter very often. So, yeah. And it also, I think with frescoes, it involves what you need is a commission. What you need is, yeah. unless you have your own home and you want to do something in your own home, that's fine. But generally, fresco painting had to do with commissions, and yeah. Commissions because you're dealing with a space that right. Is like a piece of architecture. So
it's like architecture in that yeah. sense. It's a commitment. I mean, it's one of the things about frescoes is that if somebody is going to hire you to paint a fresco, the idea is that they're kind of stuck with that. I mean, they could paint over it if they wanted to, but chances are you're not going to just hang a picture on the wall and cover it up. I mean, it's sort of a commitment on the part of a patron.
Yes.
And it takes a certain stable kind of patron to want to do that, to commit a wall to forever. That wall is going to be a fresco.
Yeah, well, it defies movability in change, yeah. which is which is contrary in a way. I mean, you could talk about this a long time about where maybe our modern society is. I mean, it's the opposite, where right now everything moves around and everything is changing all the time.
Right.
So there was this I can't remember the company, but their motto was change is our most important product.
Right.
Which is, I mean, I don't know what it means, but it's one of these things that you think, what do they mean? What are they talking about? Yeah. So anyway, the fresco is to me is opposite of that, and it's a kind of commitment and a kind of also it has to do with a wall and and the meaning. What is the meaning of a wall, and what do we think about it in terms of what walls mean? Sometimes you can say, well, a wall is a barrier, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're protection, and sometimes there are surfaces which can say something, So it's an interesting, let's say, contrast, the fresco and the wall itself, an interesting contrast to glass and transparency and steel. And so it is a kind of, to me, it's always meant a kind of stability in some way, but that's my own. Well,
it does. It tends to be done on masonry walls that don't move. You don't want cracking, and it's all about permanence, and the idea is that they do last. So we have some questions. If I could do that and start taking some questions. So, the first one's addressed to me, but it really, we can both handle this, and this might actually be a chance if you want to share your screen for this one. It says, you describe frescoes as putting pieces of a puzzle together. So when I talked about the copy that I made, I described the giornate as like a kind of a jigsaw puzzle, that essentially they're intersecting pieces that allow the painting to sort of emerge day by day. So this person says, what does the back of each piece look like, and how does the artist attach each? So you don't really attach. So they're asking whether you attach the fresco to the wall. But I mean, if you watch the demonstration, you're really watching basically plastering happening on the wall. I mean, there are ways that you could sort of mount a fresco to the wall, but the idea traditionally is that you're laying a final finish coat of plaster on top of at least one or two other layers of plaster that are a ground for that. And the idea is, again, that you're only plastering as much as you think you can paint in a day. That's the giornata of a fresco. So that idea that fresco is a kind of a puzzle of pieces. Next week, I'm going to show the overlay of the giornate on the School of Athens for next week's presentations. But do you want to share that?
Sure.
So Richard has some images from a 15th century fresco. So the century before Raphael, from Prato, so a city just outside of Florence.
Can I do it now?
Sure, yeah, please.
Okay. Here you're seeing the fresco underneath and an overlay of the giornate. They're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And it gives you an idea of how they plan this thing. You're starting from the top, of course, and then moving the scaffold down. This group of frescoes was done by Paolo Uccello and another artist in Prato, in the Cathedral of Prato, a town just north of Florence. In any case, you see that he felt he could handle the whole architectural scene in one day. And then when you started getting into figures, you get, oftentimes heads in one day, just for a head. It depends on how, special the head is, how difficult it is. Here in number 7, as you see, it's the head of San Stefano and Saint Stephen, and he's raising his hands up, and which is probably a fairly complicated drawing problem. He's got a drawing underneath here, though, by the way, which is called the Synopia, which I'll show you in a minute. But you get an idea of what they think they can handle in a day. And it's sometimes shocking to see how much they did in one day. But anyway, the drapery seems to be, handled all together, but even the heads themselves. Let's move. I can show you. Here's the drawing.
That's the Synopia.
Synopia. That's underneath the fresco. When you detach the fresco, which you can do, and the layer of the fresco is extremely thin, you'll see the drawing, and they show the drawings when they can, so you're able to see the drawing.
Yeah, in Pisa, there's actually a museum of Synopias. So the Synopias basically disappeared. I mean, they were, once the frescoes executed, the Synopia is covered up by plaster and, is never seen again. Richard said you can take frescoes off the wall. That's a modern restoration technique that was perfected with a lot of lost frescoes where they didn't know what they were doing. But by the 20th century, they had it pretty well figured out in Italy. And when frescoes were being damaged, often not from the surface, but from what's coming up within the wall, to save the fresco, basically they had to pull it off the wall. And we won't have to talk about the process, but the person I studied fresco with was one of the masters in Italy of that preservation process. And when they peeled the frescoes off the wall, they found these underpaintings on the rough plaster, on the Aricio, the Synopia. And they're amazingly free, loose things, because the artist knew no one's ever going to see this ever again. It was just for the artist. It was basically like a roadmap of, where you're going to plaster each day. And you piece by piece, cover it all up, and then it disappears. And they probably thought no one would ever see it again. So Synopias are interesting things to see because they're really a very personal thing of the artist for his own purposes. And very bold and loose and not meant for public consumption. So they're really interesting how much they did and how loosely they did it.
Yeah, they're like brush drawings, really, aren't they?
Yeah.
So it's not like with a pencil or a Conte crayon or something like that. It's with a brush, and they can be extremely free. Let's move on. Here's the finished painting of the Disputa di Santo Stefano, and that's the final result. And this is pre-Raphael, of course. This is 15th century painting, and but you also get an idea of the range of color and intensity. Beautiful. We'll go. This is another painting, more in a way more complicated. There's a lot of architecture in it. It's the presentation of Maria in the temple. So you see these again, the giornate, starting from the top, big areas, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, he handled all those figures up in number 3 and 4 all together inside the round temple.
Yeah.
Then when he comes down below, number 9 is just the Virgin, Maria on the step. Okay, you've got to be careful with it. It's got to really be good. And then other big areas of the figure standing. Okay, 6, and then you have 13. It's fascinating for me. I mean, as an let's say an artisan, to say, oh yeah, well, see, maybe he had some trouble there. I was hoping, so to say, well, this guy's human, too. And it took him a whole day to do one head. So
And it might be because it's also in an isolated spot. He might have chopped it out and redid it. In fact, the reason it's the last one, it might be that he didn't like it and, changed it.
Right.
Okay.
I think that.
Thank you, Richard.
Oh yeah. Okay. Here's the
yeah.
final. Here's the final painting, so you get an idea what it with the proper colors, what it really looks like.
Yeah.
Also, you have to remember, look at the borders. Now, those little heads in the border are painted by Paolo Uccello, important painter of the 15th century. So, and then all the decorative stuff had to be painted around the borders as well. So you have to, everything has to be worked out in terms of a schematic, daily, what's going to be happening that day, how it's going to be, where the scaffolding is going to be, everything else. So it's a real team effort and project.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have another question. There's a number of questions. So, what had to be restored on Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel fresco? Does the paint fade? I had heard that candle and incense smoke had covered the art with a layer of soot. If it is difficult to change a fresco when it's fresh, how can it be restored without starting over? So, the restoration of frescoes is a very challenging thing because you don't want to take away, obviously, anything that the artist did. And so the big question for the Sistine ceiling was, so mostly what happens in frescoes, if they're not missing pieces, what they mostly want to do is just clean them. I mean, essentially, as this question suggests, get rid of all the soot and all the stuff that's accumulated over time. And over the course of the history of the life of the Sistine ceiling, other people had tried to restore it. They even varnished it at a certain point, because they thought it was looking dull, so they slapped some varnish on it. So the restorers in the 20th century, late 20th century, were basically just peeling off all that stuff that essentially wasn't Michelangelo and getting back to what was Michelangelo. So the big controversy was, did Michelangelo touch up his fresco after it was dry? So did he work what's called secco, or dry, onto the plaster? So so this has a lot to do with Michelangelo's philosophy of fresco. Artists in the 16th century tended to treat that like it was cheating a little bit, or at least the older fresco tradition was he tried to do everything in what's called buon fresco, or true fresco, good fresco, as opposed to basically touching up in secco, which is not to say people didn't do that. They did. So the restorers in the Sistine ceiling had to figure out what Michelangelo might have touched up and what was touch-ups by other people that they could get rid of.
Yeah.
And some of that is science. So they actually did core samples. They actually took little, microscopic core samples through the fresco. And wherever there was dirt between the layers, they assumed, or soot or whatever, they assumed that had accumulated over time. So anything that was on top of a layer of soot or dirt, they assumed was after Michelangelo. Under the layer of soot or dirt, is kind of where it was a little more complex, and that was more of a judgment thing, I think.
When I was up there on the scaffolding in the Sistine, talking to the restorer, he pointed out, he said, this is by Michelangelo, this secco piece. Mm-hmm. So he obviously did it. But you remember that something that is placed al secco on top is very fragile.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes off. It's not part of the wall.
Right.
So that's the problem.
And that is the issue with fresco is you are painting because you think it's going to be permanent and you want it to be there forever. And one of the reasons, secco wasn't just, kind of cheating because you couldn't do it in a day, but also they knew that it wasn't as permanent.
They in this, when they were cleaning the Sistine, lots of things had been, especially the eyes, under shadow under the nose of some of the figures had been painted in rather black on top, so they could be read from below, so that people could actually see the eye, because of the soot and so forth had diminished the distinction between certain forms. So they thought, well, we'll just make it darker up here, you know, and that's what they were taking off. So they were with distilled water, basically distilled water. That was it. And they were taking this black stuff off the faces.
Yeah, so I mean, if anybody remembers when this was happening, there was a lot of controversy. It was in the news, and there were some historians who were very much opposed to it, particularly James Beck from Columbia, New York. And because what was revealed by this process was a much more colorful Sistine ceiling than the one people had known for centuries, because it was sort of brown and repainted, and it had a kind of, you know, the idea was that Michelangelo didn't really care about color because he was a sculptor, so it wasn't a very colorful thing. And then the Sistine ceiling that you experience today is kind of a riot of color. I mean, purples and acid greens, and, you know, what's called, Ingrid talked about a cangiante color, charge color, where a piece of fabric would have a, you know, a hot highlight and a cool shadow, and completely like a red and green or orange and blue, and those kind of things Michelangelo was doing. And people thought, wow, Michelangelo loved color too. I mean, he's not just a master of form, but he actually likes color. You know, that was a revelation.
Yeah, it shocked people, and it broke the image, that they had, what they thought was Michelangelo, and so it became difficult to accept for some people.
Yeah,
but
I mean, it was even the ones you just showed us, as all frescoes have been restored in the last half century or so, that his colors were the colors everybody else was using. I mean, the colors were very much a Florentine palette that everybody had access to. And he might have been doing a few bolder things than people had done, but he wasn't using any, I don't think, terribly exotic pigments. He was using the same colors everybody else was using.
Yeah. If the other problem with fresco, of course, is if it's damaged by water, or years of usually it's this calcium deposits underneath because it's moisture that hasn't been able to be eliminated, so that the surface is destroyed partly. And then I think that's a different situation. You just can't clean it. You probably have to in-paint it a little bit. So you see people restoring with a different technique, with tempera probably, or maybe even watercolor. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, there are two schools of thought. The guy that I studied, he was a restorer. I didn't study restoration, but he was absolutely of a certain school that thought you don't fill in the missing bits. You just replaster the parts that are missing, but you don't repaint. And then there are others who think, it gives you an odd impression when you're missing all these bits that you should really fill them in. But as you're suggesting, you have to do it in a way that future restorers can recognize what was original and what was different.
Yes.
Can I take a couple more? We have just a little bit of time for a couple more questions. So what motivates an artist to paint frescoes rather than on canvas or other surfaces? Sometimes it wasn't the artist. I mean, sometimes it was the patron. Fresco was also considered a relatively cheap way of covering a lot of wall rather quickly. So there was a kind of an economy because you had to work so fast. I think patrons like that because you got your work done. But it does also allow you to deal in an integrated way with the wall, that the whole wall is your canvas. When you're dealing with a piece of canvas that you're going to mount, it's going to be a fixed shape. Whereas if you're working in among sculpture, for example, and one of the things that Raphael is really responsible for is integrating stucco ornament, three-dimensional plaster ornament with painted frescoes. And the three-dimensional world and the illusionistic two-dimensional world started to interact. And over the course of the 16th century, that got even richer and much more complex. And then by the Baroque, there's this incredible merging of the three-dimensional and the two-dimensional world. And that's really, in a way, something you can only really do with fresco.
Yeah. That's a very good point. It's part of this, the surface that doesn't change in a sense. It's just all the same thing, incorporating everything else that's on the wall and so forth. So that whereas if you have canvas, you're going to have to, you have to have it have something set into a frame,
Right.
or cut out in certain ways, which would create problems. There are also problems of how one attaches canvas to the wall, etc.
I mean, Venice was a place where there wasn't so much of a fresco tradition because it was so damp and salty.
Yeah.
They had a lot of problems with moisture ruining frescoes. So there certainly were Venetian artists who painted in fresco, including Titian and then my hero Tiepolo. But a lot of mural work or ceiling work in Venice is, especially once they invented oil on canvas, is oil on canvas. I mean, that's more or less the great tradition of 16th century Venice, especially, is oil on canvas in ceilings. People like Veronese. Somebody's asking, do either of you ever get nervous on a high scaffold when painting a tall wall or a ceiling? And I'll just say for myself that I had acrophobia as a kid. I was really afraid of heights as a kid. I think maybe because I love painting frescoes so much, I've managed to get past that, at least when I'm painting a fresco on scaffolding. But it is an issue. I mean, you're up there. I mean, and there's actually, I can find it and I can share it. It may even be it's either late 15th or early 16th century woodcut of an image of a fresco painter being saved by the Madonna he was painting as he's about to fall off the scaffolding. He's falling backwards, and the Madonna he's just painted reaches out and grabs his arm and saves him from falling off the scaffolding. It's a fabulous image of the artist being saved by their art.
I think several artists have been, I mean, there are documents that have been seriously injured or killed falling off of scaffolding.
It has happened.
It has happened.
Last thing, and I'm going to turn this over to Sylvia, but somebody's just asking about Monte Cassino, which was destroyed by bombing in World War II. Yeah. And the person I mentioned, Pietro Annigoni, the Italian artist who, basically retired and painted frescoes for the rest of his life and taught Ben Long, was the one who did all the new frescoes at Monte Cassino. And Ben Long, in fact, actually worked with him at Monte Cassino. So there's actually I think there's a Ben Long figure and a pendentive at Monte Cassino. So I think that's about the right time. Sylvia, do you want to take over and talk about what we're going to do next?
No, I don't. I want to keep on listening, really.
Okay.
But
I want to thank. I should thank Richard though, but because Richard and I, as you could probably tell, could talk about this forever.
Yes.
So.
And I think most of us could be listening forever. So, but thank you very much. It's fascinating, and really also, the intersection between medium and message really gets richer and richer the more you explore it. So thank you, Richard, as well for the time and the great suggestions, and of course the sharing of your experience. I'm here essentially to introduce the breakout sessions now. They will last 15 minutes, and we invite all of you who are interested in participating, to introduce yourselves and discuss two questions that are coming from our faculty today. One is, what is your experience of the hand and mind connection in learning? And the second one is, do you know of any fresco paintings in your part of the world? As always in our conversations, we expect that everybody will follow rules of civil discourse and respect each other's comments. And please note, if you choose not to participate in the breakout rooms now, you may leave the meeting and join us again next week. As a reminder, for next week's meeting, please watch the mini short explainer videos that Professor Mayernik made available on the ThinkMD website. And feel free to share this series with your friends and family who are accepting registrations throughout this program. Each meeting in many ways can stand alone. So again, thank you for joining us today. We're going now into the breakout rooms at this moment.